In our headlines at this hour, President Yoon Suk-yeol is in Madrid, poised to make his in-person debut on the diplomatic stage via the NATO summit amid Russia's atrocities in Ukraine and Pyongyang's ambitions in nuclear weapons. The group of 7 leaders have denounced Russia's latest missile attack on a shopping mall in Ukraine, calling the assault a war crime. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky, for his part, has called for anti-aircraft defense systems. Meanwhile, electricity bills here in South Korea will be raised starting July in reflection of soaring oil prices. An average household of 4 members will see their bill going up by some 1,500 won. Hello and welcome to the program. This is a daily report for Tuesday afternoon. It's June 28th here in capital Seoul. President Yoon Suk-yeol is now in Madrid, Spain, preparing to partake in the 2-day NATO summit that begins this coming Wednesday. That would be June 29th. He has also a host of separate meetings scheduled on the sidelines of that security summit. My colleague Moon Gon-young starts us off.
President Yoon Suk-yeol landed in Madrid, the host city of the 2022 NATO summit, late Monday night to participate in the multilateral meeting for the next 3 days. Not only is this Yoon's global debut on the multilateral summit scene, but it's also a first for a South Korean president to take part in a NATO gathering. South Korea is one of 4 Asia-Pacific partner nations that's been invited to this year's gathering by the 30-member North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Speaking to the traveling press on Air Force One, the new president seemed less anxious and more confident about his international debut.
NATO 동맹국에다가 이제 그렇게 초청받은 파트너 회담만 한 2시간 만되고 나머지는 다자회담이 짧게 있어가지고 길게는 못합니다. 한 39개, 38개 국가 국제기구가 오니까 시간이 많지는 않아요. 얼굴이나 익히고 간단한 현안들이나 좀 서로 확인하고 이제 다음에 다시 또 보자 그런 정도 아니겠나 싶습니다.
Seoul's top office is eyeing various achievements.
The president will take this opportunity to strengthen solidarity based on values and liberal democracy, establish a base for comprehensive security, and seek effective ways to counter emerging security threats.
At the meeting of the North Atlantic Council with partner nations, Yoon is also expected to unveil his North Korea policy on a global level for the first time, an audacious plan to denuclearize North Korea. But that's not all. The new South Korean president has meetings scheduled with other world leaders. Here, Yoon will discuss economic security issues including nuclear power plant exports, arms sales, cooperation on semiconductors, and hydrogen power. And there's a trilateral between South Korea, US, and Japan, which was only finalized at the 11th hour. This is it, right here in Madrid. From showcasing South Korea as one of the leading nations in global issues and nailing sales diplomacy at the highest level to dealing with Japan ties in the context of Seoul, Washington, and Tokyo, and South Korea-Japan bilateral ties, South Korean President Yoon Suk-yeol has a lot to prove right here, as this will serve as a litmus test for the next 5 years. Moon Gon-young, Arirang News, Madrid.
In related news, the upcoming NATO summit brings together countries beyond the North Atlantic to include those in the Asia-Pacific, namely South Korea, neighboring Japan, Australia and New Zealand. Now, pundits say the extended gathering comes in light of an aggressive Russia and an assertive China. Our Kim Dami reports.
The 2022 NATO summit may be another sign of Atlantic-Pacific nations teaming up against the bellicose challenge of Russia, and particularly the growing global assertiveness of China. By inviting South Korea, Japan, Australia, and New Zealand as Asia-Pacific partners, the U.S. is once again making use of NATO to keep Beijing in check.
Countering China at NATO appears to be not enough for the US, since NATO is a European security alliance. So by inviting Indo-Pacific countries, Washington is trying to pinpoint the Chinese threat at NATO.
In fact, NATO's new strategic concept is set to include the very first mention of China and its threats, a clear indication that China issues will no doubt top this year's agenda. Another expert points out that South Korea's debut at the global military alliance also comes in a timely manner.
Economically, the US has brought South Korea into China issues with IPEF, but politically, Seoul cannot join the Quad for now, so the Biden administration has invited South Korea, citing global security reasons.
That also falls in line with the Yoon administration's pursuit of beefing up comprehensive security networks with its partners. Plus, Yoon's presence at NATO will serve as a perfect opportunity for Seoul to drum up international cooperation on North Korea issues, especially the regime's latest nuclear threats. The Biden administration has been upfront that the participation of Indo-Pacific nations at NATO directly targets China. Amid Seoul's ambitious goal of strengthening value solidarity based on a liberal democracy, South Korea is expected to play along with Washington's stance. But watchers also caution against the possibility of retaliatory action by Beijing on Seoul, even in a discreet manner, such as during the diesel exhaust fluid shortage in South Korea, which stemmed from China's suspension of urea exports. Kim Dami, Arirang News.
And NATO says it will expand the size of its high-readiness forces to more than 300,000 troops from the current 40,000. Speaking to reporters on the sidelines of the NATO summit Monday, Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg claimed the planned expansion seeks to strengthen the alliance's eastern defenses. He added the move is part of what he described as the biggest overhaul of the alliance's collective defense and deterrence since the Cold War. In Ukraine, a Russian missile attack on a crowded shopping mall has prompted international outrage. Our Soohyun has more on this latest unprovoked atrocity, that is, by Kremlin against Ukrainians.
More than 4 months into Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and the bloody onslaught continues. On Monday, 2 Russian missiles struck a bustling shopping mall in the central city of Kremenchuk. Around 1,000 people were reportedly inside the mall before air raid sirens went off. According to Ukraine's emergency services, at least 16 people were killed and 59 injured. But the figures are likely to grow.
For now, establishing the number of victims is not yet possible. A fire broke out in an area of more than 10,000 square meters. The rescue operation continues, but we must be aware that the casualties can be significant.
In response, Ukraine has requested that a United Nations Security Council meeting be convened. A spokesperson for the UN told CNN that the meeting will take place on Tuesday at 3 p.m. New York local time. Being the first Russian government official to comment on the attack, Moscow's deputy permanent representative to the UN took to Twitter to label the attack a provocation by Kyiv. The strike came as Group of 7 nations began their annual meeting. After being notified, U.S. President Joe Biden, who was attending the summit in Germany, condemned Russia's attack as, quote, cruel. The president also promised unwavering support for Ukraine, adding that the U.S. and its allies will keep holding Russia accountable for its atrocities. Biden's comment comes after the G7 leaders said Monday that sanctions on Russia would be kept for as long as necessary. The bloc also vowed $29.5 billion worth of support for the battered country so that it could deliver basic services to its people. Earlier on the same day, President Zelensky gave a virtual address to the leaders, urging them to provide Kyiv with advanced missile defense systems and more aid. 송유진, Arirang News.
Also on the international front, the leaders of the US and China could be set for talks in the near future. Now that's according to US National Secretary Advisor Jake Sullivan, speaking at a press briefing on Monday, during which he claimed President Joe Biden and his Chinese counterpart Xi Jin-ping may hold talks over the next few weeks. He added the meeting will not immediately follow the G7 summit, which ends on Tuesday. Sullivan also spoke of growing convergence among G7 and NATO members over China-related challenges, including issues such as non-market practices, debt and human rights. Now, earlier this month, Mr. Biden, too, had shared the possibility of imminent talks with Mr. Xi Jinping. Meanwhile, a week-long combined drill involving the Army, Navy and Air Force is underway here to assess the military's ability of deploying troops and delivering supplies in times of warfare. Our Defense Ministry correspondent Peun Ji has more.
The South Korean military will be carrying out what it calls sustainment training, involving all of its armed forces from land, air, and sea. South Korea's Joint Chiefs of Staff said Monday the training will be able to better prepare the nation's armed forces for challenging situations such as when supply routes become blocked or restricted during battle. The exercise will be held for 5 days throughout this week until July 1st off the country's west coast.
The sustainment training is an actual field training exercise organized by the Joint Chiefs of Staff that involves troops from the Army, Navy, and Air Force. They will be trained to appropriately provide troops and equipment to the battlefield during war.
Later this year, the country also plans to participate in a cyber defense exercise led by the U.S. The Defense Ministry's deputy spokesperson noted that the South Korean military has been conducting various measures to deal with evolving cyber threats.
About 20 personnel will be joining the Cyber Flag exercise hosted by the US Cyber Command and scheduled to be held this October. We're also considering taking part in the cyber defense exercise organized by NATO.
This comes after the South Korean President Yoon and US President Joe Biden had said in a joint statement following their summit last month that they'll significantly expand cooperation to deal with cyber threats from North Korea. Peunji, Arirang News.
And that ends part one of the Daily Report. In part two, we discuss South Korea's recent launch into space and beyond. Stay with us.
Share South Korea's experience in tackling COVID-19 and introduce a Korean new A Korean survivor of Japan's wartime sex slavery met with
extraordinary climate crisis and pledged to work with the EU to tackle the challenge.
The objective of its North Korea policy is
protesters gathering across the country to peacefully demand an end to hate and violence.
Arirang, what matters?
Welcome back. South Korea has made its entry into the world's most exclusive space club as its 7th member, having successfully placed a payload weighing over a ton into orbit precisely a week ago. For more on this, I have Andres Sanchez-Brown, a correspondent for EFE Spain. Welcome back, Andres. It's good to see you.
Thanks for having us here, as always.
I also have Stephen Clark, editor at Spaceflight Now, live on the line. Stephen, it's a pleasure to have you as well.
Thanks for having me.
Right, Andres, we'll start here in the studio. I understand you were there for the actual launch last Tuesday. And that being said, let's begin perhaps with a few words on the significance of South Korea's latest advance into space.
That's right. I was actually there to witness Noori's successful flight. This actually is a huge leap for South Korea in aerospace terms. Let's actually point out that, let's remember that Noori is actually 100% domestically manufactured, developed and manufactured, which means that South Korea joins this very exclusive club of 10 nations, only 10 nations in the world that are capable of launching or putting a satellite into orbit with their own 100% autochthonous, domestically developed technology. That said, also because Noori was successful on deploying a verification satellite and a dummy 1.3 ton satellite, that means that it actually did join to an even more exclusive club, which is that the one that formed by only 7 countries in the world that are capable of putting a satellite into orbit, a satellite that is that weighs more than 1 ton, which means it's a very powerful tool. What does this mean for Korea? Basically, Korea is going to be able in the future to deploy as many satellites as it needs to, whenever it needs to. And also it opens the door for third parties to have access to this technology, which means private enterprises or other countries can use this technology to deploy their own satellites.
Right, and we'll get into that in a moment. But first then, Stephen, researchers here say they'll be conducting 4 more test launches within the next 5 years. Now, is this the norm after a successful first mission? And what is perhaps the purpose of this repetitive operation, Stephen?
Yeah, this is normal for this phase in the life of a relatively new launch vehicle. Engineers will want to improve the reliability of the rocket and demonstrate different operating modes and show that the rocket can carry satellites into different types of orbits. Typically, it takes a few years for a new rocket to establish itself and begin operational, regular cadence of missions. And these test launches over the next 5 years or so will be designed to prove that the launch vehicle is reliable for those third-party customers, for other customers, domestic customers within Korea who want to launch their satellites. And if you count these upcoming 4 launches over the next few years, that'll be 6 missions for the new Noori rocket. And for comparison, it took SpaceX, who is the leader in the commercial launch market right now, about 4.5 years to launch its first 6 missions with its Falcon rocket program. So the Korean program is moving a little slower than what SpaceX started out moving back in the 2000s. But this does show that it does take a number of years to establish a launch vehicle as a reliable option to carry, these big ticket, expensive satellites that are critical to Korean national security and critical to commercial customers.
Right. And Andres, North Korea, our northern neighbor, placed a satellite into orbit back in late 2012. Now, that being said, what has been disclosed about South Korea's space technology as compared to that of North Korea? Well,
North Korea actually said that it had deployed a satellite back in 2012. It actually said the same thing in 1998 and 2009, but those flights of their rockets actually ended up in failure. In 2012 and then again in 2016, the NORAD actually confirmed that it had deployed something into space. The thing is that nobody has ever actually been able to register any communications from these devices. So all we know from the North Korean program is that something's floating in space, but it doesn't probably operate as a satellite. So that's another reason for many people believing that this would be an exercise used to test ballistic missile technology. This said, compared to South Korea has around, I believe, somewhere between 30 and 40 satellites already in space, launched by different means in different countries. Now it has a satellite that launched 100% with domestic technology. These satellites range from communication satellites to actually Earth observation satellites that could be used for reconnaissance, and that is, yes, spying. And well, in the future, the idea is that thanks to projects like Nuri, it will be able to launch more and more of these satellites, for example.
Right, and staying with that, Stephen, what look to be the gains for South Korea, given its latest success on the next frontier? I mean, some claim surging interest in commercial space operations could perhaps translate to immense profits for South Korea once its launches, that is, have been mastered, so to speak.
Well, a couple of things come to mind, one of which was already just touched on by Andres. This vaults South Korea into a small group of countries that can build and launch their own satellites. You know, with South Korea, there are around 10 now countries in the world that can launch satellites with their own technology. And as we just heard, 2 of these countries are on the Korean Peninsula, who can at least put something into space, put something into orbit. So I think you can't ignore the geopolitical value and advantage that South Korea gains with this successful launch. And remember, some of these technologies that are used in space are also transferable to military use for reconnaissance and spying, as we just heard. And secondly, you know, adding this launch piece really gives South Korea a more broad spectrum of space capabilities. South Korea has been building more and more complex satellites dating back to the 1990s. And South Korea is now building world-class Earth observation and environmental monitoring satellites. And these satellites and their camera instruments built in Korea have been sold to companies around the world, including to the United Arab Emirates, also to customers in Turkey and Singapore and other places. And worldwide, the last few years have really been a boom time for the commercial space industry. And South Korea so far has been a niche player, but with their ever-increasing capability in satellite manufacturing, and now this domestic launch capability coming online with the Nuri program, there is a new opportunity to tap into this market if this rocket proves to be reliable and affordable, which is a key aspect going down the road.
Right, I see. Now, Andres, the broader interest in space missions is also fueling greater concern over space junk. I believe it was last Tuesday when sky watchers over in Spain were alarmed to see a series of slow-moving fireballs, I believe, in the early morning sky. And experts said it was most likely debris from a Chinese rocket. Do you suppose adequate efforts, Andres, are being made, perhaps, to address the issue of space junk?
Well, actually, you're right. It was actually debris from a Changzheng Chinese rocket, what was seen in the skies of southern Spain. But that said, actually, what is more worrying, because that is, after all, debris that is falling back into the atmosphere and disintegrating, and nobody, not that I know of, has ever been hurt by any falling debris, but because by the point it falls to Earth, it's basically the size of a few millimeters. The problem with space junk is the one that is still orbiting around Earth at tremendous speeds. Some people have calculated that around 128 million of very, very small fragments of this space junk is floating around. Then somewhere around 30 to 40,000 of bigger pieces, including whole satellites, are floating around. The problem with this is that the impact, just the impact of one of these tiny pieces into a functioning satellite can not only cause this satellite to malfunction, but will generate more junk and cascade into something that is potentially very dangerous, because we would be losing all of a sudden TV networks, mobile communications networks, etc., etc. Is this being addressed? Yes. For many years, there's been a lot of R&D put into this. But then the problem again is who is responsible for all this junk? So all these efforts are still on the board. I believe the European Space Agency is planning to launch a device in 2025 that will start collecting some of this debris and trying to move it towards the Earth's lower orbits, and then eventually making it disintegrate. But then this is still on a very premature phase, and definitely more needs to be done.
Right, so it remains a daunting task then for the international community. Meanwhile, Stephen, reusable rockets have been mentioned as part of efforts to ensure sustainable space missions. And what more can you tell us about this technology and the time needed perhaps to acquire it?
You're right, there's a lot of interest, especially in the commercial industry, in moving to reusable rockets. And SpaceX, the company I mentioned before, led by Elon Musk, has really shown this to be technically and economically viable with really good results. SpaceX here in the United States is the only company in the world currently flying a reusable rocket on this scale. Here you can see a Falcon 9 rocket from SpaceX launching. And it took SpaceX about 10 years from their first ever launch until they successfully recovered one of their rocket boosters. So it was a program lasting more than a decade, and then another year and a half until they were able to refurbish and then refly one of those boosters. So they had a lot of experimentation, testing, lessons learned, adjustments. They would fail in a landing, find the problem, then fix it through different iterations of their design to get everything tuned just right to make it possible to land and reuse their rockets. And now these launches and landings are fairly routine. It's a difficult technology to master, though, and requires a significant investment up front to be able to invest in all the infrastructure to be able to recover and refurbish and reuse the rockets. And that's why no other company other than SpaceX has really done this yet. But lots of companies have plans to start reusing their rockets. Once you've done it, once you accomplish it, the benefits are enormous. Launches get less expensive. You don't have to build an entire new rocket for every mission. And there are some compelling arguments, I think, from engineers that reusing a rocket actually makes it more reliable, because just like an airplane, because engineers can get a rocket hardware back. They can inspect it, discover problems that could cause a failure on a future mission, and kind of preempt any potential failure down the road. And it makes the rocket more reliable in some respects.
Right, of course. Meanwhile, Andres, what can you share with us about Spain's own space ventures and the public response to them?
Well, that's a good question, actually. I mean, Spain launched their first satellite back in 1974, I believe, using always foreign technology. Spain hasn't been able, unlike Korea, to launch its satellites using 100% domestical technology. There was a project some 20 years ago called the Capricorn project, but it ran out of funding in the end because apparently institutions and universities that should have been interested in launching smaller satellites than the one that Nuri has definitely deployed into orbit didn't feel as interested as apparently it was believed initially. So right now, I believe Spain has somewhere around 20 to 30 satellites that it has launched. Of course, not all of them are operational anymore. It does have some reconnaissance satellites, lots of communication ones. But then the difference, once again, is that it can't launch its own satellites using its own technology. So that's a big difference, I guess.
Right, I see. Stephen, South Korea hopes to land a probe on the moon by the year 2030. How feasible does this mission look to be?
That'll be a challenging mission, but based on the technology that I see South Korea having, they appear to be on a good path to accomplishing the goal. One of the missions to prepare for a potential lunar landing by South Korea is an orbiter mission that will actually be sent to circle the moon. And it was built in South Korea and is scheduled for launch in the August timeframe. Actually, it will be launching from here in Florida, from Cape Canaveral on a SpaceX rocket, but the orbiter and most of the instrumentation on board all come from South Korea. And this will be South Korea's first mission beyond Earth orbit. And it will orbit the moon to perform a variety of scientific observations, including the mapping and reconnaissance and surveying for a future lander. So this mission, if it goes well, could help lay the foundation for a future robotic probe that could land on the moon from South Korea. Another thing I'd like to mention is South Korea has also signed up to the Artemis Accords, which is forming a basis for partnership with NASA on the Artemis program, which is the NASA agency is developing to send astronauts back to the surface of the moon, hopefully, potentially later in this decade. Astronauts haven't landed on the moon since 1972. So this agreement that South Korea and other countries have made with the United States signal that South Korea could have a supporting role to play in the NASA moon program, although the details of this partnership haven't been finalized yet.
Right. Andres, some pundits believe that the global community needs to seek a tangible and common consensus with regard to space missions to allow for safe explorations in the future, that is. What are your thoughts on this?
Well, I believe that actually consensus is a must when it comes to space exploration. Not only we've seen along all these decades that space exploration, all humanity benefits equally from it, but also, and as we were talking just a while ago about things like, for example, space debris, space junk. It's actually right now a big issue determining, whose is this piece of junk out of the 120 million fragments that we were talking about. Starting from issues like that, consensus is a must when it comes to space exploration, and I hope that going forward, we're seeing a lot of countries right now, like South Korea, showing growing interest in cooperating with other countries. For example, with the Artemis American-led mission towards the moon, and so on. I think that's a good sign of what's to come in the future.
Right. Stephen, meanwhile, talking about the future, what more, or space missions that is, can we look forward to this particular year?
Well, I mentioned the South Korean lunar orbiter that's going to be launching in a couple of months' time, as well as the Artemis program. And in fact, one of the major pieces of the Artemis program is this giant new rocket called the Space Launch System. It's more than 30 stories tall. It's designed to carry astronauts back to the moon. And in fact, the first version of the Space Launch System is complete. It's on the launch pad right now here in Florida. And this rocket will launch for the first time later this year on a test flight without any crew on board. And if that goes well, if it's successful, the next mission later down the road in a couple of years could actually have astronauts going back to the moon. And this is a long-awaited, this is a flagship program for NASA. They've been working on this for about 10 years. And it's all culminating in this upcoming test flight with this giant new rocket. That's one thing. Another thing is SpaceX, the company I mentioned before, is also working on its own powerful commercial rocket. It calls it the Starship. And it's just similar in scale to this NASA moon rocket. And the Starship could make its first flight into space later this year as well. These are enormous rockets. These are rockets that are 100 meter height. They are by far, by a wide margin, the largest rockets in the world and among the largest ever built. And both could be launching for the first time in a few months. Another thing, potentially, we talked about the moon, is there are some commercial companies here in the United States that are developing privately funded commercial landers to actually try to go to the moon. And the first of those could be launching later this year and landing on the moon either at the end of the year or in early 2023. And that's part of the whole push that NASA and space agencies and companies around the world are trying to focus on to try to foster this commercial, privately developed space effort, and partnering between government and commercial companies to try to go back to the moon and go deeper into space at less cost than it was done back in the 1960s in the Apollo program.
Right. And against that backdrop, this is an impromptu question, Andres. There are critics of space explorations who claim that we don't have enough financial resources to support or pursue these explorations because we have so many problems here on Earth. As a person not affiliated with any of these space missions, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, maybe I can't be 100% objective on this ground because I've always been passionate about space exploration. So I'd be lying if I say that I want these missions to be at least frozen as of now. I believe that actually it's been a long time since the last moon landing. If I'm not mistaken, that was 1972. It's been a really long time, and I think there's a growing interest towards not only the moon, but of course Mars missions, and there's more competition amongst big superpowers in this sense. And I believe that what's to come is actually going to be very exciting, as actually Stephen just put it, just told us, right?
Right. Stephen, what are your thoughts with regard to these concerns by people? Because some advocates of space explorations have said that space mining could prove to be quite important for those of us here on Earth. Would you like to add a few words on that?
Yeah, there are entrepreneurs in the United States, certainly, and I think around the world, that these are high wealth individuals that already have made their money in other industries that have a passion for space exploration. Elon Musk comes to mind. There are other entrepreneurs as well who are doing this to try to use their own wealth to advance space exploration instead of putting all of that cost on the taxpayer. And a lot of it are doing it just out of passion and interest. Some see an economic opportunity. Space mining, you mentioned, mining minerals from asteroids that those minerals could be returned to Earth for economic benefit. I don't foresee that happening in the near term. That could be something that is a spinoff down the road, years or a decade from now. But what we're seeing right now is a lot of venture capital, a lot of entrepreneurs investing lots of money, billions of dollars, tens of billions of dollars in many respects, into various companies that are launching things into space, that want to land on the moon, that want to build a space station, a commercial, privately operated space station. And space agencies, government agencies like NASA see this opportunity and want to marry up with these companies and partner with these companies, because that means they can develop more capability without putting all of that cost burden on the taxpayers.
Right, that is true. All right, Stephen, thank you very much for your insights today and for joining us live. And Andres here in the studio, thank you very much for your thoughts and your time.
Thank you so much for having us here.
Thank you.
Starting July here in South Korea, utility bills, including those for electricity and gas, are poised to go up in light of soaring global oil prices. Our Kim Yeon-sung reports.
Electricity rates are going to rise by 5 Korean won per kilowatt hour in the third quarter. Korea Electric Power Corporation, or KEPCO, announced the new prices Monday afternoon. For an average household of 4, this will mean their bill goes up by about 1,500 won, or about $1.20. That might not seem like much, but the hottest months of the year are yet to come. And the increase will be felt more because other costs are going up so much with inflation. But the increase is much lower than what KEPCO had suggested. It said it needed a price hike of at least 33 won per kilowatt hour to make up for the money it's been losing because its prices were kept artificially low. With energy prices rising globally, KEPCO in the first quarter posted a loss of more than 7.7 trillion won, or about $6 billion. So the government had to strike a balance as it tries to pull KEPCO out of a deficit and not put too much pressure on consumers. 5 won was where KEPCO and the government struck a deal. The government also made some changes to the energy pricing rules. Until now, electricity rates could go up by no more than 3 won per quarter. Now KEPCO can raise rates by as much as 5 won. Still, with more summer heat on the way, KEPCO is giving bigger discounts to households on low incomes so that they don't have to worry too much about using air conditioning. Up to 3.5 million households could benefit from a discount of almost 10,000 won a month, about $7, which could actually make their bills lower than they were in the second quarter. But gas bills are going to rise next month, too. The monthly gas bill for an average household will go up by around 2,000 won, or more than $1.50. So combined, electricity and gas bills in July will be $3 to $4 higher than they were in June. Kim Yeon-sung, Arirang News.
Seoul's top finance official has voiced concerns of the potential repercussions of excessive wage hikes within the corporate sector. During a meeting with the Korea Enterprises Federation on this Tuesday, Finance Minister Chu Kyung-ho said high wage increases could serve to accelerate inflation. He also touched upon its impact on further widening the wage gap among workers, that is, in general. Meanwhile, the Minimum Wage Committee is addressing related issues today as labor unions demand an 18.9% rise in light of escalating consumer prices. The managing community, for its part, is calling for a wage freeze, pointing to the struggles of small businesses. Also on the local front, the number of households is forecast to decline after hitting a peak in 2039. Now, this peak has been brought forward a year from a previous projection made 3 years ago. Data released by Statistics Korea on Tuesday put the number of households in South Korea at around 21 million in 2020. The agency says this figure will hit almost 24 million by the year 2039 and then fall to around 23 million in 2050. It also adds the number of people living alone will account for 40% of households in the year 2050. South Korea's Shinsegae Group ranks 7th in terms of sales across Asia. Coupang, Lotte and Naver, meanwhile, stand among the top 15. Our Shinsebyok has more on these findings.
South Korean retail giant Shinsegae, together with 3 other local firms, have been included in a list of the top 100 retailers in Asia 2022. According to the list released by market researcher Euromonitor last week, Shinsegae Group were 7th, with the highest ranking for a South Korean company. It moved up 2 notches from the previous year and is the only Korean firm in the top 10. Coupang ranked 11th, followed by Lotte at 12th. South Korean internet giant Naver took 15th spot, of 5 places from the year before. An industry expert says that South Korea's competitive edge lies in successfully balancing between online and offline channels.
Big South Korean retailers have so-called multi-retail channels. They realized the importance of managing both online and offline channels quite early and have successfully managed those channels since then. That's what makes those firms stay competitive on the global stage.
The report attributed Shinsegae's strong performance to the group's acquisition of eBay Korea last year, saying the firm successfully built synergy between online and offline sales channels. Overall, Chinese retailers made up the top 3 firms. Chinese e-commerce giant Alibaba led the list with sales of almost $479 billion, followed by JD.com and Pinduoduo with their sales of $368 and $112 billion, respectively. The 3 firms together recorded a total of whopping $1 trillion in sales, taking up over 70% of the total sales from the top 10 companies. Meanwhile, calling the Asian retail market a trendsetter, Euromonitor says the Asian market makes up more than 1/3 of the global retail market, with a projected annual growth of 7% until 2026. The market expert also painted a rosy outlook for retail.
Asia is showing a higher economic growth rate than any other region in the world, and this leads people in Asia to spend and consume a lot more. As long as this growth trend continues, the Asian retail market will get bigger.
신세벽, Arirang News.
South Korea's first COVID-19 vaccine candidate, SKYCoV-1, may secure its final approval this week. The National Institute of Food and Drug Safety Evaluation, that is, said on Monday that it will announce its decision on the vaccine candidate in the coming days. The shot, developed by SK Bioscience, has successfully completed all 3 phases of its clinical trial. It has also received an approval recommendation from the Ministry of Food and Drug Safety's Central Pharmaceutical Review Committee. The committee said the vaccine candidate's neutralizing antibody response is almost 3 times better than that of AstraZeneca. Once approved, SK Bioscience plans to commercialize the vaccine sometime in the second half of the year. Growing interest in public health as well as that of the environment has led to greater interest in meat alternatives. What's more, one study shows some products have higher protein content than beef. Here's Chung Eun-ju.
This is a restaurant for vegans. It serves steak and burgers made of beans, but the flavor and texture are very similar to the real thing.
I made the patties by implementing high moisture manufacturing technology using soybean protein and tried to bring out the flavor of meat by using charcoal and rice straw.
The Korea Consumer Agency recently studied 15 plant-based meat alternatives and found that the ones that are cholesterol-free actually had higher protein ratios than real beef hamburger patties. However, it was also found that 4 products had relatively high saturated fat ratios due to the process of making them juicy, and 3 products contained excessive sodium in their seasoning. Moreover, all 15 products were meant to be plant-based or vegan, but some contained egg, which vegans cannot eat. There are currently no clear regulations regarding food types or standards for plant-based meat alternatives in South Korea.
To guarantee consumer choice, it's necessary to have a set of labeling standards regarding ingredients and manufacturing for meat alternatives.
The U.S. Food and Drug Administration is preparing to release guidelines within this year for meat alternatives. The Korea Consumer Agency has also decided to make requests to the relevant ministries for meat alternative standards. 정은주, Arirang News.
Let's take a look at what's going on in the world now. At least 10 people have been killed and 251 injured following a chlorine gas leak in Jordan's southern port city of Aqaba. The leak on Monday came from a tank carrying 25 metric tons of the chlorine gas, which was being exported to Djibouti. Footage shows the tank falling from a winch onto a ship's deck, followed by a yellow-colored gas escaping into the air. According to officials, the area has been sealed off after evacuating the injured to hospitals for treatment. Specialists have been dispatched to handle the leak. Nearby residents have been urged to stay indoors and keep windows and doors shut. Appealing to governments around the world at the United Nations Ocean Conference, UN Secretary-General Antonio Guterres asked for more efforts to save the world's dying oceans. Speaking at the start of the 5-day event on Monday in the Portuguese capital, Lisbon, Guterres requested a larger commitment of funds to create a sustainable economic model for managing the world's oceans. Roughly 7,000 people are expected to attend the conference, including heads of state, scientists, and NGOs. Guterres told them that the ocean is facing a crisis.
Sadly, we have taken the ocean for granted. And today we face what I would call an ocean emergency. We must turn the tide.
The ocean plays a vital role in the planet's ecosystem, generating half of the world's oxygen and absorbing a quarter of all CO2 emissions. But temperature increases have made ocean waters more acidic. In the U.S. state of Missouri, an Amtrak train carrying 243 passengers and 12 crew has derailed. The train was traveling from Los Angeles to Chicago on Monday when it hit a dump truck at a rail crossing. Multiple deaths have been reported, while 3 passengers have been taken to a nearby hospital, and emergency services are working to free those trapped inside the carriages. Photos posted to Twitter show what appeared to be the remains of a truck in the wreckage and people clambering out of the 8 derailed train carriages. This is the second train collision in 2 days. On Sunday, an Amtrak train hit a passenger vehicle, leading to 3 deaths and 2 major injuries. Brazil might be known for Rio de Janeiro's famous carnival, but another major festival happened this week in the Amazon rainforest. The Boi Bumba Festival celebrates the color, music, and traditions of the Amazonian folklore. It returned to the city of Parintins on Saturday, following a 2-year pause due to the pandemic. The event is marked by a contest between red and blue teams Garantido and Caprichoso, as they portray a legend about a resurrected ox. For 3 days, each team works to outperform the other with their diverse portrayals using color, rhythmic performances, and floats. On Monday, Caprichoso team were named this year's winner. Matthew Ashley, Arirang News.
Good Tuesday afternoon. The rain has been on and off in Seoul, and however, rain clouds are likely to intensify from tonight, bringing torrential downpours to central regions with up to 50 millimeters falling per hour. A total of 200 millimeters is expected in and around the Seoul metropolitan area and inland regions of Gangwon-do province, with a heavy rain advisory in place. And now many regions, including the capital area, are under a strong wind advisory, with wind speed up to 20 meters per second. That means storm force wind. So make sure your outdoor furniture and accessories are safely stored or firmly secured. While it was quite hot and muggy this morning, now many regions, including Daegu, are battling the heat, and other regions will see a combination of heat and high humidity. So your priority should be keeping yourself cool and hydrated. Well, unfortunately, we have more intense rain in the forecast centered on the midsection area of the country. As lower ground is prone to flooding, please do whatever you can do to protect yourself from water damage. Now let's take a look at the worldwide weather conditions.
And on that note, we end Tuesday's edition of the Daily Report. Thank you for watching. See you same time on Wednesday.